Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the player preview series continues with three key members of the Timberwolves bench. We're going to talk about what Rob Dillingham's role is going to be with the team this year, what Joe Ingles will need to provide off the bench, and what the expectations are for Nickeil Alexander-Walker. It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Today, we are continuing the player preview series. It's been a steady stream of preseason games here, and that continues this week with a back-to-back preseason games on Wednesday and Thursday. So we're going to cruise through most of the rest of the bench today. We'll get to three key members that will all be, I think, in the Wolves rotation this year. On today's show, preview what their roles will be, what the expectations should be for each of these players. And that's what we've got on the docket here on this Tuesday. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So the way we've been doing this series is over the last week or so, I've done basically three players a day. Did the camp guys, the two-way guys, some younger players, I think, on Friday's show. And today we're really kind of into the rotation. We did Josh Minott, and like, frankly, Minott belongs in this category as well. Garza's kind of on the outside looking into the actual rotation. But given what we've seen in preseason, I think Minott is also part of this group of players who are all likely quote-unquote rotation guys, but like on any given night, we may not see Joe Ingles. We may not see Josh Minott, but they're both kind of on the fringe of that rotation. However, and Rob Dillingham, actually the same thing. I said this on Monday's show, like there's a chance there's some games he doesn't play depending on how he looks early in the season. I think the intention is to play him. We'll get into that today. Alexander-Walker, I'm going to hit last today. Obviously, he's a key member of the rotation. He's, he and DiVincenzo are, and NAWs, that's like the top 8, right? But we're going to hit Alexander-Walker toward the end of the show today. But I want to start with Rob Dillingham because he's the one that I think has the widest range of outcomes here. And the Timberwolves protected themselves a significant amount by acquiring Donte DiVincenzo. There's this whole narrative around this trade, like, hey, the Wolves now have, or I should say, narrative prior to the trade, question marks about how the Wolves were planning to, have a backup point guard that's 19 years old and 164 pounds and didn't even start in college, even though he won the National Sixth Man of the Year award and all that stuff. And there was some concern, like, how can you call yourselves a finals team and rely that much on Dillingham? Well, the counter to that, obviously, all along was, well, they went into last year with Shake Milton as the quote-unquote backup point guard. It got rid of him midseason for Monte Morris, who was not even 100% healthy. And, like, they obviously made it work last year, cobbling together the backup point guard minutes. The thought with Rob Dillingham, and I've said this before, but just real quickly, to kind of level set here where I'm coming from today, that the plan for Rob Dillingham is twofold. One, more self-creation and catch and shoot ability off the bench, like somebody else who can score for themselves and catch and shoot, which Naz Reid falls into that category, but he's also not a lead guard, right? He's a center, really kind of a 3 and a 4's body, right? That's Naz Reid. And so they wanted that in the backcourt. Like, you're not really getting that from Nickeil. Nickeil's great. We'll talk about him later. You're not going to get that from anybody else that was on the roster at the time. Now, DiVincenzo also fits that bill. But the idea with Dillingham is like, look, this dude shot 48% on catch and shoot threes, nearly 100 attempts in college. We know he can shoot. We also know he can score off the bounce. There's some question marks defensively, and there's some question marks, can he orchestrate an offense, etc. But at the very least, we've gotten ourselves a volume scorer off the bench, which is something, and somebody who can catch and shoot, provide another shooter for a team that it was the best three-point shooting team in the league last year by percentage as a team, but there's still more there, right? There's still more the Timberwolves can, they could buoy their offense even more by shooting more threes and making more threes, and Dillingham contributes to that. The second piece, of course, is that Mike Conley's 37, and has 2 years left on his deal, obviously started to wear down a bit at the end of last season. What's the succession plan at point guard with no cap space? Now that cap issue is it's still an issue. It's less of an issue after the cat trade, but this was a way for the Timberwolves to have cost certainty and add upside, add talent, like legit potential starting caliber talent without paying the piper now in terms of, I kind of mixed that metaphor a little bit, but paid through the nose for it now, we'll say, by acquiring, yes, he's a lottery pick and he's expensive, but it's the upside for Dillingham in a rookie contract is much greater than some random veteran on the minimum contract where you're going to pay a penalty anyway for being over the second apron. So those are the reasons. Now, what does Dillingham actually provide, and why and with DiVincenzo in the fold, what are they going to ask of him? Well, I'll go back to what I said when they drafted him, basically my post-draft scouting report, and just kind of hit a couple things. He's a really good scorer and he's a shot maker. If I could describe Rob Dillingham in one phrase, I would say he's a shot taker and most of the time a shot maker. Now, we've seen in preseason, he's had a couple of pretty inefficient games, but I think the first game he actually scored it pretty well. The second game he was inefficient, but he had like 9 assists and no turnovers. So the third game he didn't really do anything well. But he could get to his spots and get his shots off from anywhere. His size doesn't matter when it comes to getting his shot up at the rim, and he's got good enough touch and feel that, generally speaking, it's not like he's shooting wild shots just to shoot them. However, he can devolve into that sometimes. But the saving grace here is he's such a good catch and shoot player. Again, 48% on 88 attempts, catch and shoot threes last year at Kentucky. He was also 38% off the dribble from 3-point range. And he was good off the dribble from everywhere on the floor. If you look at his shot chart in college, off the dribble, he made shots from everywhere. He's also really good in pick and roll. We saw this. He did a lot of pick and roll with Rudy last game. Rudy didn't play against the Sixers, but Rudy did play against the Knicks on Sunday. We saw quite a bit of Dillingham Rudy pick and roll. So I think there's a lot of upside there. Dillingham has a good floater. He didn't shoot a lot of it at Kentucky, but when he did, it went in. And we've talked in the past, Conley and Gobert didn't do the lob game as much last year as they had done in Utah, but Conley's got a good floater. Floaters and lobs, it's the same motion, right? It looks the same. And so to keep defenses on their heels, I think the Timberwolves saw that as upside for Dillingham. Like if he could score off a floater and he could throw lobs to Rudy, that could be a really nice wrinkle in our offense where we could do that with our backup point guard. I think Dillingham already has really good feel. I think his decisions to attack or pass in college were very good. He's been a lot more hesitant in preseason. And the speed of the NBA game, the size of the NBA players, the athleticism, that's all. Like we saw him get caught in the air at least twice on Sunday against the Knicks and just get stuck and not know what to do. He didn't do that at Kentucky. So there's going to be a learning curve there. And again, DiVincenzo and Nickeil Alexander-Walker are safety blankets that are going to help the Wolves for those reasons. To me, though, offensively, like he's going to have these nights where he doesn't shoot the ball well. Everybody does, but Dillingham's going to get his shots up when he's on the floor. The way I look at him is he's more of I think that we'll see him as a shoot first off the ball guy. Like he's not truly the backup point guard. If you're watching on YouTube, I keep doing air quotes every time I say backup point guard, because that's like what he should be. And the goal of him in the future is to be the lead guard for this team and to take Conley's role as a starting point guard. But right now they see him as more an off the ball shot maker, like catch and shoot for three, creating off the catch for himself or for others maybe it is a pump fake drive and kick to the corner for somebody else to shoot it, but he's not necessarily initiating the offense all the time. He will at times, but I would think of him more as a Jamal Crawford, Lou Williams type right now than as a true point guard. And maybe that changes, or maybe he'll always be that type of a player and you could start him or you could bring off the bench or whatever. But this year, that's his role, is volume scoring and hopefully efficient scoring off the bench, but not necessarily the backup point guard. He's going to score. And the level of volume he's going to get is okay. The amount of the speed he's going to play with. The Wolves want to play faster. That's how Rob Dillingham wants to play. Chris Finch has said it a million times. I've said it a bunch on the show. They want to play faster. Dillingham's going to help them do that. And some variance in scoring because of the more possessions and the breakneck speed, that might be okay when he's running with the bench unit. And what's the point of diminishing returns in terms of the number of shots he's going to get up at the rim and the number of shots he misses? With the bench unit, I think it matters less. And I'm curious to see him play a little bit with Ant. I don't know that we'll see him and Ant play a ton together. I think you'll more see DiVincenzo and Ant share the floor, and maybe Dillingham's on the floor and Ant's on the bench. We'll see, but that won't surprise me if that's how this ends up. But I think of this year's version, rookie 19-year-old Rob Dillingham, as an off the ball creator, a secondary playmaker, secondary type scorer off the bench. That's what I think is most likely for Rob Dillingham this season. I want to transition to talking about Joe Ingles. Joe Ingles is another key addition to the bench this year. I mean, two of the three guys we're talking about today are prior to the DiVincenzo Randall trade, two of the I guess the only two real rotation level acquisitions that the Wolves got this year. So we're going to talk about Joe Ingles here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Game Time. Game Time is a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time Picks also curates the selection to make it easier to save more on whatever it is you like to attend. If it's sporting events, of course, they've got that. I've also got concerts, comedy, theater, and more. You can also toggle on the all-in pricing feature to make sure to see the total up front, and that way there's no surprise fees at checkout. You just got to make sure to toggle that option on. You can also get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Game Time's ticket coverage means that your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDON NBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, let's talk about Joe Ingles. And when the Timberwolves signed Joe Ingles, I thought he was just kind of a one-for-one Kyle Anderson replacement. And I think ultimately that could be when he's on the floor. I think that it still is what he is. At this stage, especially given what Josh Minott has provided and how the rotation has looked in preseason, I don't know how much Joe Ingles will play. I mean, it's possible he's the 10th guy or the 11th guy even. And I think there could be some, like, as I've said many times before, you've got your starting five, you've got Nas, Alexander-Walker, DiVincenzo. That's your top 8. At this point, I think it's likely Dillingham. The intention is he's 9th, and then Ingles or Minott are 10th. But really, it's possible some nights you get Ingles and Minott and no Dillingham. Some nights you might get Ingles and Dillingham, no Minott. Some nights you might get Minott and Dillingham, no Ingles. Like, I think that's all possible. And of course, early in the season, it's a feeling out process. I mean, 2 years ago, Nas got like 5 DNP CDs in the first 10 games. Remember that? Like back early 22-23 before Cat's calf injury. So like it's a feeling out process, and we'll see. Ingles has played a decent amount in preseason, which has surprised me a little bit. I thought they'd try and save his legs a little bit because he's certainly started to slow down. He's, I think, also 37. Like what he provides that's better than Kyle Anderson did. Well, let me start here. So here's why he's replacing the Kyle Anderson role, because he's that big 3, small 4 off the bench who can initiate offense, run pick and roll, a decent enough team defender. We'll talk more in a minute about defense, and a bit of a Swiss Army knife offensively where he could do a few different things. Now, he's obviously a better shooter than Slow-Mo. I know Kyle Anderson's making threes for the Warriors this year. I mean, he made threes sparingly, but at a high clip for the Wolves a couple of years ago. Obviously, Joe Ingles is a superior three-point shooter. He's 41% for his career. He was 43.5% just last year for Orlando as a 36-year-old. He's still only 4 years removed from finishing second in 6th man of the year voting for Utah in the 2021 season, so the second COVID-shortened season. Like, the dude can still shoot it extremely well. And he's also got chemistry with Rudy. That's also superior to for whatever that's worth. And I think it's worth something. Kyle Anderson and Rudy, never really quite clicked. It was a little better last year. Obviously, they had the famous sideline spat in game 82 a couple seasons ago. And that's not really what I meant, but I think it all kind of worked together where they just didn't quite click. Rudy and Joe Ingles were teammates forever in Utah. And clearly there's a pick and roll chemistry there, for better or for worse. I mean, there could be some times where perhaps Ingles is forcing it. I mean, Ingles is a bit turnover prone as well. We'll talk about that. So was Kyle Anderson last year. But I think the most important thing is not simply the Wolves adding a 41% three-point shooter. It's replacing a complete non-shooter who would absolutely wreck the spacing when he was on the floor with the guy that you can't leave open. And if you do, he's going to make the shot. That's the biggest thing. Like, yeah, upgrading to a 41% shooter is great. But when literally everyone else on this team can shoot the three except for Rudy, when Rudy's not on the floor, they could play 5 out all they want. Rudy's the only guy in this team in the top 10 of this rotation that does not shoot threes. And really, honestly, other than Jesse Edwards, two-way center, rookie, undrafted, he's the only guy on the team that like can't shoot a three. Everybody else at least can. Like Josh Minott clearly has improved in that area. Obviously, Luka Garza can hit them, more at a league average clip than a above a league average clip. But Rudy's the only guy that isn't going to shoot a three. So by taking the only other guy who won't out of the mix and replacing them with somebody who's one of the better 3-point shooters of the last decade, and Joe Ingles is that in terms of consistency. He only had one season that was below 39%, going back to 2015, 2016, and even that year was almost 39%. Honestly, it was 38.6. So like one of the better shooters of the last decade, that matters. Now, where is there a step back? Well, defense. Kyle Anderson is a good on-ball defender. And I think sometimes he was a little bit overrated in that regard because he could get switched on to smaller guards at the point of attack. Sometimes he could get beat off the dribble because of his limited athleticism. But because he was so smart, because he's so smart, because of his length, he was passable against quicker guards. And he was really good against wings a lot of the time and solid in the post if he needed to be as well. So Kyle Anderson was Chris Finch called him a Swiss Army knife a couple of years ago. And that's the best way to describe Kyle Anderson. He could do a little bit of everything. And it's going to hurt to not have that piece defensively. Joe Ingles, you do not want him switched onto a guard on the perimeter. He's physical. He's tough. He knows how to play. He's going to be a solid team defender. I actually think Kyle Anderson's maybe a little overrated defensively. And I think in terms of like one-on-one defense, and Joe Ingles maybe a little bit underrated defensively because of how good he is in a team concept. But there's still a gap there. And the hope is that giving up a little bit of that defense and gaining a little bit back on offense while still maintaining the playmaking piece and the size and the veteran leadership and all that stuff, that it's going to come out in the wash as a net neutral, if not a slight positive for Minnesota. And when they signed him, I felt really strongly about that. I don't know that I feel as strongly now, the more that I've kind of dwelled on it. But I honestly, I go back to the point of replacing a non-shooter, complete non-shooter with an outstanding 3-point shooter is going to have a big impact on the units when Ingles is on the floor. Obviously, he's older too. He's like 4 years older than Kyle Anderson, 5 years older than Kyle Anderson. We started to see Ingles slow down the last couple of years. I guess 2 years ago, he finished the season, or he played the whole season in Milwaukee 2 years ago, and then last year in Orlando, but he's still been an effective player when he's on the floor. So, but over the course of the season, maybe that matters a little bit. And then overall versatility, which I already touched on a little bit. I mean, like Ingles just doesn't do as many different things, even if his one awesome skill, which is 3-point shooting, is superior to any one singular skill that Kyle Anderson has. I touched on turnovers earlier. Joe Ingles turned the ball over almost 22% of the time last year. He had a turnover rate of 21.7%. Now, Kyle Anderson's was high too, is 15.6%, which was like second on the Wolves, believe it or not. But obviously that's a lot lower than Joe Ingles' mark. And Ingles has like always turned the ball over a fair amount because when he's operating the offense, he's taking chances in the pick and roll. He's trying to hit backdoor cutters. He's trying to do stuff with the ball in his hands that, he also had an assist rate last year at 23%, which is a little lower than Kyle Anderson's. So there's some concern there with, I mentioned this earlier, like forcing the ball to Rudy. Could they overplay that a little bit? I think that's possible. And that's a slight concern for me, but in all, we're talking about the team taking a slight step back defensively, a slight step forward offensively when Ingles is on the floor. And what's his role look like? Well, Kyle Anderson played every single night. I don't know that we're there with Joe Ingles because Josh Minott's been so good and because they also just acquired Donte DiVincenzo. I know they play different positions, but they're both kind of like off-ball creators. DiVincenzo's going to have the ball in his hands quite a bit when he's playing with the bench unit, but that is the role they can play as a secondary playmaker, secondary scorer. So that could also potentially eat into Joe Ingles' minutes a little bit. But I do think again, I'll keep going back to this. I think the threat he provides when on the threat he offers when he's on the floor is going to have a big impact on the Wolves. Now, if you look at some of the advanced numbers, the Joe Ingles units were actually better defensively than the impact. Like some of the box plus minus, which can be pretty noisy, suggests that he had a better impact defensively than he did offensively, Ingles. And that goes back to my point about team defense. I think it says more about that than it does about his actual offensive impact. I think the turnovers are what kind of affects that box plus minus those numbers a little bit, which obviously that matters. But again, for the Wolves, if he's going to stand in the corner and make threes, like that'll play, right? It's more the team defensive concept, and can he be effective within that? And I think the answer is yes. All right, let's close by talking about Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who is a player that really kind of emerged on the national stage last year in the playoffs, and I think is a pretty intriguing member of this Wolves rotation that we aren't really talking a whole lot about right now. So we'll talk about Nickeil here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start your basketball season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Of course, NFL, there was a Monday night game last night. There's 2 Monday night games next week, by the way, which I just learned, and I don't really understand that, but I'll take it. This Thursday, there's a Thursday night game, and I'm going to see who it is real quick. But FanDuel's a ton of fun when it comes to football season, and there's basketball as well. And now that we're almost through preseason, I mean, like, nobody really wants to. You do you if you want to bet on NBA preseason, but I think right now NFL is the play. NBA regular season though is only a week away. Like the Timberwolves opener is 1 week from today. This coming Thursday, the game is Denver at New Orleans, which is a weirdly intriguing game for me. Denver's favored by 1.5 at New Orleans. I know the Saints are starting Spencer Rattler, but I kind of don't hate Saints plus 1.5 in that game. Even Saints money line for plus 116. I think that could be a really intriguing one. Go check that out. Check out NBA win totals. The Wolves are still at 52.5. I'll give my official prediction probably a week from now, leading into the season opener on my Timberwolves win total prediction. Go check that out at FanDuel. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, NBA, NFL, whatever it is, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet at FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel.com. All right, let's talk about Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So last year, going into the season, I saw Nickeil as kind of I didn't know how much he would play ahead of the likes of Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. In my mind, those guys were in part insurance against Alexander-Walker not playing as like when the Wolves acquired him from Utah, he was almost treated as a throw-in. And like transparently on this show, I kind of treated him as a throw-in when the Wolves got him in the Mike Conley trade. He, first game in from Utah, going back, almost 2 years now, he didn't play. And then he played a little bit more and was, a contributor on the fringes of the rotation, but he'd been barely in the rotation for a mediocre Utah team and not even mediocre Utah team. And then last year, from day one, the Timberwolves said, hey, you're a part of this rotation. And he was super impactful and certainly better than Shake Milton, better than Troy Brown. Like he actually had a role within the Wolves rotation. And most of that was defensively. Like he was a key part of the defense. He ended up starting 20 regular season games last year. He's the only player in the team that played in every game for the Wolves. And he made a name for himself in the playoffs. And there was the possession when he was bodying up Jamal Murray at the timeline and just making his life miserable, clapping his hands, getting in a stance, pulling his shorts up, ready to go. And that's when I think people on a national level were like, oh, this dude could defend. And he also had that game. I have the game log here. Was it the Phoenix series when he just went nuts? Oh, yeah. The first 3 games of the Phoenix series, he scored in double figures. Game 1, he had 18 points on 7 to 12 shooting, knocked down 4 threes. He scored in double figures in the first 3 games of the Phoenix series. Now, he only did it twice over the final, 13 games of the playoffs. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But he got off to a really hot start in the playoffs when it was really important that he did. And his defense on Jamal Murray, and especially those first couple games of the second round, was awesome too. That is still his role. And he ended up being a pseudo kind of backup point guard for the Wolves last year. And like officially, he only, let's see. Well, actually, he played, according to Basketball Reference, and this isn't the end-all be-all here, but the position estimate was that he played 43% of his minutes at point guard. That feels about right. And some of the time he was on the floor with another point guard, Monte Morris, Jordan McLaughlin, and he was still initiating the offense. And the Timberwolves on-off numbers were all very positive. Nickeil Alexander-Walker on the floor. So that was kind of his role, was like a kind of backup point guard, and basically all the time with the second unit, he was the primary point of attack defender. They were relying on him to slow down the ball. That was the Alexander-Walker role. I think it's basically the same role this year. And it's funny because, like, I know they have Rob Dillingham, but as I said in the Dillingham segment at the top of the show today, I don't know that Dillingham's going to be asked to run the offense. We've seen this in preseason where Alexander-Walker has basically been running the offense for the Wolves. My biggest question for Nickeil, like, we know he's going to be able to defend. Like, that's not a question. And he has lapses. I mean, who doesn't? But, after Jaden McDaniels and a motivated Anthony Edwards, it's Nickeil Alexander-Walker as that next point of attack defender. And he's vital to the Wolves always being able to have essentially two of those guys on the floor at once. My biggest question for Nickeil is the three-point shooting for real? I believe the answer is yes, and I'll explain what I mean by this. So over his first 3 seasons in the league, which was, well, actually, let's do this. Yeah, we'll call it first 3 seasons in the league. So 2 years in New Orleans, he was traded to Utah at the trade deadline in 22. So this is 158 games. He shot only 32.9%. on three-pointers, just 33% outside the arc going into the 22-23 season. And that was one of the biggest things. Like, hey, if he was supposed to, like, initially as a lottery pick, the idea was like, hey, this guy, or I guess he wasn't lottery, he was right outside the lottery. But the idea for him coming out of Virginia Tech was he could be did he have upside to be a scorer, like an on-ball scorer, like a legit starter that can score the basketball from anywhere on the floor. They tried to make him that in New Orleans. It didn't work out. And then all of a sudden, he couldn't shoot threes really well either. His overall field goal percentage was under 39%, and his three-point percentage was under 33%. This is only 2 years ago. The year before last, through this last season in Minnesota, so his 2 years in Minnesota and the first half of that year prior in Utah, he's been 39% from three, 38.9%. So he's improved his three-point percentage by 6 points from years 1 to 3 in his career to 4 and 5 in his career. So the evidence, the volume isn't quite as great as it was in the first 3 years, but it makes more sense that a player would improve than get worse, right? So, like, it makes sense that he's gotten better, and now we have 2 years worth of data. The only argument to the contrary is that the three-point shot kind of fell apart in the playoffs. Like, through game 2 in Denver, now, to be clear, the Wolves won their first 6 games of the playoffs, and everybody was joking about could they sweep the playoffs and everything. They won their first 6 games last year in the playoffs. They swept Phoenix. They won the first 2 games against Denver. And Alexander-Walker shot 35% from 3, which is, below his season average, but we'll take it. And he had the 4 for 9 in there. He had a 4 for 7. He had a 4 for 10. And then in the rest of those games, he combined to go like 2 for 14. But still, 35% through the first 6 games of the playoffs. The Wolves were 6-0. The final 10 games of the playoffs, he shot just 24.4% from 3. He had a couple of 0 for 4s. He had an 0 for 5. He had an 0 for 3. His minutes actually dwindled a bit toward the end of the Dallas series. He played only 13 minutes in the last game of the season, 13 minutes the game prior to that. So 35% in the first 6 playoff games, 24% in the final 10. Now, how much of that is just situation? How much of it is legs? How much, at that point in the year, you're talking about playing into the final week of May? We don't know. But assuming that the body of work of the regular season, the last 2 regular seasons, and remember, he played in every single game last year, is more legit than just 16 games of the playoffs, he's a 38, 39% three-point shooter. And if that's what Nickeil Alexander-Walker is, and he can be a plus defender, then he is a 3-and-D guy who also can run the offense. And that's how valuable he is for the Wolves. They signed him on this steal of a deal last summer, 2 years, $9 million or whatever it was. So this year he's only getting paid $4.3 million. And I just kind of resigned myself to, like, hey, he's going to walk in free agency. He's going to get, 3 times that, assuming he has he's only 26 years old too, by the way. I mean, he's 5 years in the league. He just turned 26 at the beginning of September. But now that the Wolves pulled off this trade, they could potentially retain him next summer, depending on how this year plays out. I mean, he's going to get expensive if he has another really good season. But he's a really important piece for this bench, because I think there's maybe a couple more question marks about him than DiVincenzo, just in terms of his 3-point shooting. Is it for real? But those two together, it's really hard to find a better a better duo off the bench in the backcourt. Like what those guys could start for 26 of 30 teams, I bet. DiVincenzo or Nickeil Alexander-Walker, like one of the two of them would start on basically every other team in the league. Maybe 29 of 30 or 29 of 29. Seriously, like those guys are both starting caliber players, and not to mention Naz Reid. I mean, that top 8 is better than any team in the league. And I maybe that's kind of a fun off day exercise we could do at some point this year is stack up the top 8s on every team. But Nickeil's a big part of that. And assuming that what he did last year is what he's going to do this year, the Wolves still have a steal on this, $4.6 million or whatever Nickeil's getting paid this year. He's going to be a big part of this rotation and shouldn't get lost in the DiVincenzo hype and excitement. All right. Wednesday, we're going to I think I'll do DiVincenzo and Nas on Wednesday's show. We'll just kind of split the show between those two. We'll get you ready for Wednesday night's Wolves-Bulls game. And then Thursday show will be a post-game pod. Friday show will be a post-game pod. Monday and Tuesday of the following week, we'll get you ready for the opener, which is next Tuesday, 1 week from tonight, the 22nd. The Wolves are in LA. That's what we got in the next week. I mean, it's happening. We're ramping up. Also, later today, I think the season preview episode for the top of the Western Conference will be live on our feed here. I did this show with Locked On Nuggets, Locked On Mavs, Locked On Suns, Thunder. I'm trying to remember who all was the top of the West. Thunder, Suns, Mavs. Who else am I forgetting? I don't know. Anyway, let's check it out. Whoever I'm forgetting it, they're supposed to be one of the best teams in the Western Conference. That show should be live later today on the feed and on YouTube. So go check it out here at Locked On Wolves. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, you can find this show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also watch on YouTube and on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen. Now, for your second listen, go check out Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Become a fantasy basketball expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Josh Lloyd. Find Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.